Do you remember those underrated sitcoms? The ones that made you laugh, made you think, and somehow still got ignored? These shows were part of our evenings, our routines, our living rooms, and they deserved more than silence. How did something so good get forgotten while lesser shows lived on? Frank's Place only lasted one season, just 22 episodes. But if you saw it, really saw it, you know how quietly brilliant it was. This was not a laugh-track sitcom. It was something else, gentle, honest, sometimes funny, sometimes devastating, and never, not once, dumbed down. It starred Tim Reed as Frank Parrish, a Boston professor who inherits his father's New Orleans restaurant and finds himself pulled into a life and a city he barely understands. But what made Frank's Place special was not the premise. It was the tone, the pacing, the dignity. This was a show about Black life that felt lived in, not exaggerated, not sanitized. It showed culture, food, struggle, history, and humor all at once. And it refused to explain itself to white audiences. That alone made it revolutionary. But Frank's Place never shouted. It invited you in. Like a warm plate and an old story, it expected you to sit down and listen. And if you did, you got something no other network sitcom was offering in 1987. It blended drama and comedy in a way that felt seamless before dramedy was even a word. Episodes flowed like memory, not punchline. One week, it was a conversation about segregation at a country club. The next, a ghost story in a bar. And through it all, the show respected its characters, never mocking, never flattening. It gave space to older Black characters, to tradition, to spirituality. That kind of storytelling was rare, still is. Critics loved it. Emmy nominations rolled in, but the ratings did not. CBS moved it around the schedule like a problem it did not know how to solve. Audiences used to louder shows did not know what to make of it. And within a year, it was gone. No big farewell, no second chance. Just one of the smartest, richest, most human sitcoms ever made. Quietly buried. And here is the part that still stings. Frank's Place did everything people say they want television to do. Be smart. Be real. Take risks. Tell the truth. And yet, when it came time to support it, no one showed up in big enough numbers to keep it alive. Tim Reed later said the show was too subtle for the time. But that was also the magic of it. Because Frank's Place was never trying to be loud. It was trying to be honest. And that honesty, even now, deserves to be remembered. Not every great show gets a second season, but this one should have. And the fact that it did not, that says more about the system than it ever did about the show. Frank's Place was not just underrated, it was one of the best. The John Larroquette Show was ahead of its time, and in some ways, that was the problem. It aired from 1993 to 1996 and starred John Larroquette as a recovering alcoholic running a bus terminal in St. Louis. That setup sounds simple, maybe even a little bleak. But what came out of it was one of the smartest, sharpest, and most emotionally layered sitcoms of the decade. This was not a show about punchlines. It was about survival. John's character, also named John, was dry, broken, regretful, and trying to hold on to his sobriety while managing chaos around him. The show took place mostly at night. Characters were drifters, loners, addicts, and people with nowhere else to be. And yet, somehow, it was funny, deeply funny, but also raw. It tackled topics no sitcom dared touch at the time: homelessness, addiction, depression, sex work, guilt, and it never asked for applause for going there. It just went. That honesty made some people uncomfortable, and in the 1990s, discomfort in sitcoms was still considered a ratings risk. But those who got it, and they never forgot it. It had a lived-in feel. Grimy, tired, honest. There was no moral lesson at the end, no neat bow to tie things together. The comedy came from recognition, not relief, like someone finally said the quiet part out loud. Even the lighting looked different, washed-out fluorescence instead of warm sitcom glow. It felt more like a stage play at 3 a.m. than a network comedy. The writing was brilliant, dark, character-driven, often poetic in its pacing. The cast, Chi McBride, Liz Torres, Daryl Chill Mitchell, brought something electric to the screen. And John Larroquette himself? He played against the smarmy, wisecracking type he was known for. He was quiet, reflective, vulnerable. The show won Emmys. Critics called it the best show no one was watching, but NBC, chasing broader appeal, forced a shift in tone during later seasons. The darkness was softened. The character depth was clipped. It tried to be more like other sitcoms and lost its edge. Still, even in its reworked form, it was better than most shows on television. But the early seasons, that original vision, that was lightning in a bottle. And it only lasted a season and a half before it got retooled. It deserved more. Because the John Larroquette Show asked real questions. What does redemption look like in the day-to-day? How do you carry guilt? Can you laugh your way through grief without minimizing it? It did not wrap things up with a joke and a hug. It let moments hang. It made space for silence. And it never made fun of the broken parts of people, only the absurdity of what we do to hide them. That is rare, even now. Most sitcoms ask for your attention. The John Larroquette Show asked for your trust. And if you gave it, you got something unforgettable. That trust should have been rewarded. With time, with space, with credit. Because this was not just a dark comedy, it was a portrait of survival. And in that quiet, unsentimental way, it deserved a spotlight it never got. Its Garry Shandling's show was not just ahead of its time, it was out of time entirely. The show first aired in 1986, but if it came out today, people would still be calling it groundbreaking. It broke the fourth wall before most people even knew there was a fourth wall. It played with form, structure, and audience expectation like it was all a big toy chest, and somehow still managed to tell something human underneath the jokes. The premise was simple. Garry Shandling played Garry Shandling, a fictional version of himself who lived in a sitcom and knew it. He talked to the camera. He commented on the writers. He walked between sets mid-episode and greeted the studio audience. The theme song literally explained the theme song. And that was just the beginning. This was a show that rewrote the rules, but gently. It was meta before meta was cool. It was clever without being smug. And it treated the audience like they were in on the secret, because they were. That kind of relationship between a character and a viewer, it is rare. It is intimate. And Garry pulled it off with ease. Every episode felt like a rehearsal and a confession wrapped in the same scene. You laughed, not just because it was funny, but because it caught you off guard. The joke structure had rhythm, but the show wasn't afraid to skip a beat just to see what would happen. It respected its audience by refusing to spoon-feed anything. It was a wink that said, "We know you're smart enough to get this, so we're not going to slow down." But its Garry Shandling show was more than just self-aware. It was deeply funny. Absurd, yes. Surreal, often. But built on a kind of emotional sincerity that grounded even its wildest turns. One episode might spoof sitcom tropes. The next might linger on loneliness or connection, or what it means to be known. And that tension between the joke and the truth made it unforgettable. The show ran for 4 seasons, bouncing between network television in the United States and Canada and cable on Showtime. Critics loved it. Comedians worshipped it. It earned Emmy nominations and a Peabody Award. But the average viewer? They never really showed up in the numbers needed to make it a phenomenon. It was too strange, too smart, too aware. And maybe that is why it never got the full credit it deserved. Because its Garry Shandling's show was not a ratings hit. It was a blueprint. It laid the groundwork for Seinfeld, for The Larry Sanders Show, for Curb Your Enthusiasm, for Fleabag, for Louie, for any series that ever dared to let its characters know they were characters. It taught a generation of writers that form could be fluid, that jokes could land even when the rules were broken, and that sometimes the most honest story you can tell is one that admits it is all made up. But Garry never got the same shine as the ones who came after. Maybe because he made it look too easy. Maybe because he was too early. But the influence is there. In every show that turns to the camera and whispers, "This is all ridiculous, isn't it?" Its Garry Shandling show never needed applause. It just needed to be seen. And for those who did see it, really saw it, it changed what sitcoms could be. The credit may have skipped it at the time, but the legacy never did. Sledge Hammer was satire in its purest form, loud, absurd, and way smarter than it looked. Premiering in 1986, it was marketed as a spoof of tough guy cop dramas, but what it delivered was something stranger and sharper. It was a sitcom that never took itself seriously. It blew up its own tone, plot, even cast safety every other episode. And in doing so, it created one of the most underrated comedies of the decade. David Rash starred as Inspector Sledge Hammer, a trigger-happy, emotionally stunted, cartoonish cop who loved his gun more than his job and almost more than his own life. He was part Dirty Harry, part Looney Tune, and somehow it worked. The joke was always on him. He was violent, clueless, and completely unaware of the chaos he caused. But instead of glorifying that, the show dismantled it, relentlessly. Every time Hammer got lucky, it was by accident. Every victory revealed more of his incompetence. And that is what made the show brilliant. It never gave the audience what the genre usually promised. It was not just slapstick, it was critique. The supporting cast, especially Anne-Marie Martin as Dory Duro, his sharp, capable partner, grounded the show. Duro saw through Hammer's nonsense, but stuck around anyway. Maybe because she had to. Maybe because someone had to keep the city from collapsing. The writing was fast. The direction was chaotic. The tone walked a line between parody and mayhem. And for 2 seasons, Sledge Hammer pulled it off. But network executives never really got it. ABC gave it a rough time slot, shuffled it around, and did not know how to market something that was mocking the exact genre it was supposedly selling. When the first season ended with a nuclear explosion, literally, the writers assumed the show was done. They blew it up on purpose. But the network ordered a second season, so they opened with a gag. This season takes place 5 years before the explosion. That kind of humor? Way ahead of its time. The show struggled to find an audience. People who tuned in for cop action were confused. People looking for subtle satire never found it. And so, in 1988, Sledge Hammer was canceled. But what it left behind was a masterclass in how to mock a genre while still living inside it. It was the spiritual cousin of shows like Police Squad, Get Smart, and later Brooklyn Nine-Nine, but even more anarchic. It taught viewers to question the hero, to laugh at authority, to recognize the absurdity of violence as entertainment, and in the process, it became a cult classic. You do not forget a show that ends its own first season with a nuclear bomb and then keeps going like nothing happened. Sledge Hammer was fearless, weird, smart, and criminally overlooked. In a television world full of formulas, it was pure chaos, and that chaos deserved a lot more love than it got. The Days and Nights of Molly Dodd was never a traditional sitcom, and it never wanted to be. Premiering in 1987, the show followed Molly Dodd, a divorced 30-something woman living in New York City, played with quiet brilliance by Blair Brown. Molly was thoughtful, funny, occasionally lost, and always reaching for something just out of frame, a career, a relationship, a sense of self. The show did not rush to define her. It let her exist in all her contradictions. And that was the magic. It was a comedy, yes, but not a set-up punchline kind of show. It moved like life does, slowly, unevenly, sometimes without a clear point. It was introspective, loose, funny in passing, poignant without warning, and it broke rules without making a show of it. Molly often spoke directly to the camera, but not to be clever, just to connect. Scenes faded in and out with jazz instead of punchlines. Characters came and went with no dramatic entrances or exits, like people in real life. And the show respected the quiet as much as it did the dialogue. It trusted the viewer to sit with things. feelings, questions, moments, without needing them resolved. That kind of storytelling feels normal now, but back then, it was radical. Molly Dodd aired on NBC for one season, then moved to Lifetime, where it ran for 4 more. It was one of the first network shows to move to cable, a shift that let it keep its soul, but also buried it from mainstream visibility. Critics praised it. Blair Brown earned Emmy nominations, and still, it remained a secret, one you had to stumble across to appreciate. And that is what makes its legacy so strange. Because the days and nights of Molly Dodd proved that you could make a sitcom about uncertainty, about not knowing what you want, about being smart and still making mistakes, about the space between chapters. It was not trying to be quirky or edgy. It was trying to be honest. And sometimes, that is harder to sell. The show quietly pioneered the tone that would later define hits like Ally McBeal, Girls, and even Fleabag. But Molly Dodd came first. And it did not have hashtags or streaming buzz or Twitter threads to explain its genius. It just was. A small, patient, beautifully written portrait of a woman figuring herself out. And maybe that is why it was overlooked, because it asked the audience to lean in, to listen, to sit in the gray areas. But for those who did, it offered something rare, not closure, not answers, just reflection. And that is a gift sitcoms rarely give. Molly Dodd did not want to tell you how to live. It just wanted to remind you that it is okay not to know what happens next. That message, and that kind of show, deserved far more credit than it ever got. Dear John was not supposed to be profound. It was supposed to be a mid-season replacement, a sitcom with a clever premise and a few decent jokes. But what it became was something warmer, sadder, and ultimately more enduring than anyone expected. Premiering in 1988, Dear John followed John Lacey, a recently divorced man trying to rebuild his life one awkward step at a time. Played by Judd Hirsch with quiet frustration and reluctant hope, John attends a support group for single and divorced adults. That is where the real show lives, in the mess of strangers trying to figure themselves out, together. It was a comedy about loneliness, about starting over, and it never once pretended that was easy. What made Dear John different was that it refused to rush the healing. It let its characters be bitter, awkward, self-sabotaging. It gave them space to be kind and petty and messy, often in the same episode. The show found its humor in truth, not in caricature, and the support group setting gave it a structure that felt intimate, even when the jokes were broad. It could be a little silly, sure. Ralph, the overconfident narcissist, Louise, the eternally optimistic grandmother, Kirk, the womanizer with the paper-thin charm. But none of them were treated like punchlines. The show saw them, flaws and all. Judd Hirsch anchored the ensemble just as he had with Taxi, but Dear John let him go deeper, into vulnerability, into failure, into something more human than most sitcoms dared to explore. And it hit a chord. The show ran for 4 seasons. It never topped the charts, but it held steady. Viewers who found it stayed. It even inspired an international version. The original Dear John was actually a British series, and the American version carried its melancholy tone over with surprising care. But as sitcoms got bigger, flashier, louder, Dear John stayed small, and maybe that is why it got lost in the shuffle. Because Dear John was not about reinvention. It was about recovery, about what comes after the big dramatic moment. And in that quiet space, it found something real. It deserves credit for telling a story most sitcoms avoid, that healing is slow, that laughter can come from pain, that starting over is not a punchline, it is an act of courage. And Judd Hirsch carried all of that in every sigh, every hopeful glance, every awkward coffee shop moment. Dear John never shouted, but it stuck with you. The cast grew into a kind of chosen family, not perfect, not sitcom slick, just there, week after week, like real people trying to keep going. And for anyone watching in the middle of their own starting over, that meant everything. It is easy to overlook a show like Dear John, it does not beg to be remembered. But if you do remember it, you remember how it made you feel. And that, more than any laugh track or Nielsen rating, is the mark of something that deserved more than it got. Just the 10 of Us should have been a mess, a spin-off, a big family, a Catholic coach with 8 kids, a laugh track, and a Friday nighttime slot on ABC. It had all the markings of a gimmick. But somehow, it became something more. When it debuted in 1988, Just the 10 of Us followed Coach Graham Lubbock, played by Bill Kirchenbauer, a familiar face from Growing Pains now front and center. He moved his giant family across the country for a new job at an all-boys Catholic school, where his 4 oldest daughters immediately turned heads and stirred chaos. But what could have been just another dad yelling while kids misbehave sitcom became something different. It was funny, yes, but also sharp, self-aware, and surprisingly heartfelt. The daughters weren't background noise. They were the story. They were smart, confident, witty, and never just one note. From rebellious Marie to brainy Cindy to boy-crazy Wendy, the girls carried full episodes, something rare for teenage female characters at the time. And the writers let them grow, mess up, and come back stronger. The show trusted its young cast, and it paid off. By the time the show found its rhythm in Season 2, Just the 10 of Us was offering more than laughs. It dealt with school pressure, peer influence, first love, faith, even grief. And yet, it was never heavy-handed. It was the kind of sitcom that knew how to juggle jokes with sincerity, a balance that even bigger, longer-running shows never quite figured out. It became a cornerstone of ABC's Friday night TGIF lineup, but unlike other shows in that block, it did not lean on magic, catchphrases, or slapstick. It leaned on family, big, noisy, chaotic, but deeply loving. And that made it real. The ensemble cast had chemistry. The dialogue was fast without being mean. The episodes felt lived in, and audiences started to notice. But network execs? Not so much. ABC quietly canceled Just the 10 of Us in 1990 after only 3 seasons, right when it had figured itself out. Right when it was telling stories that mattered. The cast never got a proper goodbye. The arcs were never wrapped up. It just ended. No send-off, no final dinner scene, just reruns. And like so many great family sitcoms, it slipped through the cracks. Which is a shame, because Just the 10 of Us gave teenage girls something rare: complexity. It was not about perfect kids or perfect parents. It was about figuring it out together, laughing through the noise, holding it together even when the world pushed in. It may not have run for long, but it made its mark, and it deserved more time to show just how special it really was. Working was everything people say they want from a workplace comedy: fast, funny, cynical, and smarter than it had any right to be. It premiered in 1997 with Fred Savage in the lead, post-Wonder Years, post-childhood fame, now playing Matt Pizer, a bright-eyed new employee at a corporate hellscape where ethics go to die and ambition is a contact sport. Think The Office, but meaner. Think News Radio, but more bitter. Working was about the dream of getting ahead and the nightmare of realizing what that actually means. The show's satire was razor sharp. Every manager was worse than the last. Every team meeting spiraled into corporate doublespeak. And every promotion dangled just out of reach, no matter how many hours you put in. It was the 1990s cubicle farm, distilled. Fluorescent lights, fax machines, passive-aggressive emails, all served with a laugh track and a smirk. Fred Savage, stepping into adult roles, was pitch perfect. Wide-eyed, naive, slowly unraveling. His boss, played by Maurice Godin, was a monster in a suit, ruthless, manipulative, and deeply hilarious. There was also Sarah Knowlton as Hal, the loyal co-worker who wanted out. Dana Gould played Jimmy, the cheerful lunatic who somehow thrived in chaos. The whole ensemble clicked. But more than that, Working understood something deeper. That adult life often feels like a performance no one applauds. You show up, you smile, you file the report, you chase the bonus, and underneath it all, you wonder what you are doing it for. Working captured that existential dread and made it funny. Not in a wacky, over-the-top way, but in the everyday absurdity of corporate life. The buzzwords, the HR memos, the team-building exercises that feel like punishment. It was satire dressed as a sitcom. But network television did not know what to do with that in 1997. NBC shuffled its time slot. Viewers struggled to find it. And then the show did what most brilliant comedies are forced to do. It reinvented itself. Season 2 brought a cast shakeup, more edge, a darker tone, and while it alienated some early fans, it sharpened the show's voice. Working became leaner, punchier, and even more direct in its commentary. But by then, it was already on the bubble. NBC canceled the show in 1999 after 2 seasons. No finale, no farewell, just another office closed for good. And that hurts, because Working was onto something. It predicted the burnout humor of the 2000s. It spoke to a generation stuck in cubicles, fighting for relevance, and laughing to survive. It showed that adult life is not always about purpose. Sometimes it is about surviving PowerPoint presentations and remembering where you parked. And Fred Savage proved he could carry a show built for grown-ups, with timing, with heart, with just enough weariness behind the eyes. Working deserved to be remembered, not just as a forgotten NBC entry, but as one of the smartest shows to ever put a tie on disillusionment and call it comedy. It told the truth about life behind the desk, and did it with a smirk. That should have counted for more. He and She was ahead of its time, which is usually code for nobody watched it when it mattered. Premiering in 1967 and gone by 1968, the show lasted just 1 season. But for a generation that rediscovered it in reruns decades later, He and She felt like a blueprint for everything television comedy would become. It starred real-life couple Richard Benjamin and Paula Prentice as Dick and Paula Hollister, a cartoonist and a social worker navigating marriage, neighbors, and New York life. That alone would have been charming enough. But He and She had something else, a tone, a rhythm, a style of comedy that was smarter, faster, and more grounded than most of what aired in the 1960s. It was funny without mugging, romantic without being cloying. It let characters finish their sentences, let women be just as sharp as men. Paula Prentice wasn't the wife. She was the partner, the co-lead, the one with better lines half the time. Richard Benjamin played exasperated but never cruel, and the show never reached for easy laughs. It trusted the writing and the audience. Jack Cassidy, as Oscar, the egomaniacal actor who plays Dick's cartoon alter ego on TV, was a walking satire of celebrity ego. And somehow, he managed to steal nearly every scene while still elevating the ones he was in. He and She was slick, well-paced, tightly written. It felt modern in a way most 1960s comedies did not. It had no laugh track, no wacky neighbors, no kitchen gags or dated moralizing. It was, in many ways, the spiritual ancestor of the Mary Tyler Moore show Mad About You, even Seinfeld. But in 1967, that style of comedy had no foothold. He and She got good reviews, great ones even. It won an Emmy. Critics adored it. Writers admired it. But CBS didn't know what to do with it. The network buried it after Green Acres, and audiences expecting corny slapstick were hit with dry wit and social commentary. Ratings tanked, and like that, it was gone. 1 season, 26 episodes, and then silence. But the weird thing is, it did not disappear. In the 1980s and 1990s, thanks to syndication and revival screenings, He and She found new life. Comedy writers cited it as influence, fans traded tapes, networks included it in retrospectives about lost gems. Because here's the thing, He and She aged well. Really well. Its jokes still land. Its characters still feel familiar. Its world still makes sense. It proved that sitcoms did not have to be broad to be accessible. That comedy could come from nuance, from frustration, from love that was complicated and still standing. It showed what adult relationships could look like on screen. Equal, imperfect, funny. And that is why it deserved more than 26 episodes. because he and she wasn't just ahead of its time. It was already doing what television would spend the next 20 years figuring out. It just got there too early. And maybe that is what hurts most about underrated shows. Not that they fail, but that they quietly plant the seeds for what comes later and never get credit for it. Richard Benjamin and Paula Prentice never acted together in another series. Jack Cassidy passed away a few years later, and the show never got a reboot or a reunion. But if you watched it, especially later, you knew. This was the one. The one that almost made it. The one that should have. The San Pedro Beach Bums became a footnote in ABC's late 70s programming, quickly buried under more successful shows that followed. It was not a disaster. It just never justified its existence. A sitcom that tried to coast on charm and ended up lost at sea. Chicago, the 1920s, gangsters, speakeasies. You would think that kind of setting would give birth to something gritty, stylish, and unforgettable. Instead, we got the Chicago Teddy Bears, a sitcom that took the world of prohibition and turned it into something utterly toothless. The show focused on a small-time tavern owner trying to stay afloat in a city teeming with organized crime, only none of it was ever scary or even remotely threatening. The tone was flat, the characters cartoonish, and the laughs minimal. It starred Dean Jones and John Banner, known for his role on Hogan's Heroes, but even their charm could not lift the show out of its weird identity crisis. Was it supposed to be satire? Farce? Historical comedy? No one seemed sure. The dialogue leaned heavily on outdated vaudeville routines, and every attempt at slapstick landed with a thud. The gangsters were more bumbling than menacing, and the plots felt stitched together from rejected drafts of better shows. CBS had hoped to capitalize on nostalgia for the Prohibition era, but viewers did not connect. Ratings were poor, critics were unimpressed, and after 13 episodes, the network pulled the plug. Aliens in the Family was one of those shows that made you do a double take. Part puppet show, part live-action sitcom, it was a science fiction oddity that aired on ABC in 1996. It followed a blended family, half human, half alien, trying to live together under one roof. Think The Brady Bunch meets The Muppets, with a dash of outer space weirdness. It was colorful, chaotic, and completely offbeat, and audiences had no idea what to do with it. Children were confused, parents were indifferent, critics were baffled. The puppet characters, created by Jim Henson's Creature Shop, were impressive, but the tone of the show constantly bounced between wacky and heartfelt, never quite landing on either. One moment, you had alien dad jokes and slapstick burps, and the next, you had tearful lessons about acceptance and identity. It didn't just blur tones, it erased the lines completely. In doing so, it gave some kids their first glimpse of what it meant to feel different and still be loved. The jokes often missed. The emotional moments felt too strange to sink in. But under all the eccentricity was something unique, an attempt to talk about blended families, about difference and acceptance, through the lens of weird intergalactic humor. It was bold. Too bold, maybe. Only a handful of episodes aired before it was quietly pulled from the schedule. It has since become a punchline in weird TV retrospectives. But there is a generation of viewers who caught those few episodes wide-eyed, wondering if they had imagined the whole thing. For them, it was not just bizarre, it was oddly touching. The show tried to say something about what makes a family, and how love looks different across space and species. This show was weird. Beautifully, unapologetically weird. The Adventures of Pete and Pete followed two red-headed brothers, both named Pete, through a suburban world that never quite behaved like it was supposed to. Their town had superheroes, personal nemeses, dancing tattooed moms, and ice cream men who waged psychological warfare. It was childhood stretched into surrealism. Every story felt like it came from a dream you almost forgot, but remembered just enough to know it meant something. There were bike rides that felt like quests, songs that seemed to change time, and friendships that dug deep into the soul. Little Pete was defiant and wild, a spark of rebellion. Big Pete was thoughtful and unsure, trying to figure out who he was becoming. Together, they made sense of a world that never did. The show never explained itself. That was its brilliance. It did not try to teach you a lesson, it just let you feel. Joy, confusion, sorrow, wonder. It trusted that you could handle that. And somehow, you always could. Pete and Pete vanished not because it failed, but because it did not fit the mold. Too poetic to be a kid's show, too silly to be called art. So it slipped between the cracks, like many beautiful things do. But if you ever saw an episode, really saw it, then you know it still lives somewhere deep inside your memory, right next to that weird summer day that felt like it meant more than it should have. Highway to Heaven was not just a show, it was a feeling, a kind of quiet whisper in the middle of the noise. You might not remember every episode, but you remember what it gave you. Hope, comfort, something soft to hold on to when the world felt a little too sharp. Michael Landon played Jonathan Smith, an angel sent to Earth, trying to earn his wings by helping people. But he was not floating around in a robe or casting magic spells. He was just there, walking, listening, showing up at the right time with the right words. And his partner, Mark, tough on the outside, warm on the inside, was the perfect companion. A former cop who did not believe in much until this strange, quiet man came along and changed everything. Every episode was a new town, a new person in pain, a new reminder that even the smallest kindness could make a difference. It was not flashy, it was not fast, but it hit deep. It reminded people that healing could happen anywhere. In diners, in gas stations, in homes falling apart from grief. The magic of the show was in its stillness. It let moments breathe. It let characters talk. And it let viewers feel, really feel, what it meant to forgive, to fight, to hold on. There were no big explosions, no dramatic music swells. Just two men, a beat-up old truck, and the quiet promise that someone was looking out for you. For kids watching in the 80s, Highway to Heaven felt like a grown-up bedtime story, one that did not talk down to you. It believed that goodness mattered, that people could change, that even in a world full of hurt, someone might still show up and help you carry the weight. You might have forgotten the names, the details, but you probably remember the feeling in your chest when Jonathan turned to the camera and said something simple and true. You remember the way it made you want to be a better person, even if you did not know how. And you remember that theme music, soft, hopeful, like sunrise after a long night. Highway to Heaven was not trying to impress you. It was trying to remind you that people are good, that kindness is powerful, and that sometimes all it takes to change someone's life is to show up and say, "I believe in you." If you took a hit movie, stripped it of its stars, softened its edge, and stretched it across a network sitcom format, you would probably end up with something like Private Benjamin. Based on the 1980 film starring Goldie Hawn, the television version hit CBS in 1981 with high hopes and a whole lot of pressure. But turning a sharp satirical comedy about military life into a weekly primetime sitcom, that is easier said than done, and the cracks started showing almost immediately. The premise stayed the same. Judy Benjamin is a spoiled socialite who accidentally joins the army and has to learn how to survive. The setup was still ripe for comedy, but without Goldie Hawn's charisma, timing, and star power, it felt like a different show altogether. Lorna Patterson stepped into the lead role and did her best, but the spark just was not there. The magic of the original film got lost in translation. The show took the structure of a military comedy and turned it into something safer, flatter, and more formulaic. Gone was the biting commentary. Gone was the tension between Judy and her surroundings. What remained was a fish-out-of-water story that leaned too heavily on recycled jokes and sitcom tropes. The stakes were low, the characters were broad, and the writing played it far too safe for a story that was originally so bold. There were flashes of potential, especially when the show leaned into the absurdity of military routines clashing with Judy's posh instincts. But those moments were rare, and instead of challenging Judy's character or pushing her to grow, the series often reset her back to square one. Every episode felt like a rerun of the same setup. Judy messes up, The army frowns, Judy charms her way out. Rinse and repeat. The supporting cast had its moments. Eileen Brennan, who reprised her role as Captain Doreen Lewis, was the standout. She brought grit, fire, and a perfect deadpan delivery that hinted at what the show could have been. But even she could not carry the weight of a series that seemed to be afraid of its own voice. Behind the curtain, the show bounced between tonal shifts. Some episodes leaned more into slapstick. Others tried for heart. But none of it really stuck. The audience never fully connected, and for fans of the original film, the show felt like a watered-down souvenir of something they once loved. Private Benjamin lasted 2 seasons, barely. CBS kept it on life support, hoping it would find its groove. But the viewership dropped, and by 1983, the network called it quits. No finale, no resolution. Just another spin-off that faded faster than anyone expected. There is nothing wrong with trying to recapture the magic of a great movie, but Private Benjamin reminded everyone that not every story is built for syndication, and not every star can be replaced. He could vanish with the push of a button. Gemini Man was a science fiction action show with a simple hook. A secret agent gains the ability to become invisible for short bursts of time. It was fast, sleek, and full of potential. But it never clicked. The lead, Ben Murphy, played Agent Sam Casey, a motorcycle-riding, beach-loving secret operative with a wristwatch that turned him transparent. The effects for their time were impressive. The idea had bite, but the scripts did not. Each episode followed the same basic arc. Invisible Man solves the case, reappears in time to deliver a wisecrack, and rides off into the sunset. There was little depth, no character growth, and the concept, while flashy, wore thin quickly. NBC launched the show with fanfare, but audiences were not impressed. The mid-70s were filled with science fiction experiments, and Gemini Man got lost in the noise. Ratings dipped. Critics shrugged, and after 11 episodes, it disappeared just like its protagonist. A few episodes were later re-edited into a television movie, but the series never returned. Invisibility, it turns out, is not much of a superpower when it comes to storytelling. Gemini Man was slick, but shallow. It promised adventure and gave us repetition. Today, it is remembered mostly by collectors and curious fans of retro sci-fi. A show that had all the right gadgets, but none of the spark. Another forgotten ghost of the broadcast era, flickering in and out of memory. Super Train was a show that promised the future and delivered a train wreck. Literally. Picture this, a massive nuclear-powered train that had everything from gyms to swimming pools to full-blown nightclubs, speeding across America like a landlocked spaceship. It was NBC's answer to The Love Boat, except instead of a cruise, you were on rails. And instead of smooth sailing, it was a multi-million-dollar gamble that crashed and burned faster than anyone expected. The production budget was astronomical for its time, higher than anything else on television in 1979. They even built a giant set and miniature models for the train itself. But viewers, they just didn't show up. The stories on board were supposed to be romantic and dramatic and weekly anthologies, but the scripts were flat and the characters forgettable. It aired on Sunday nights, and NBC had high hopes that it would become the next big thing. Instead, Super Train became the poster child for overambition. Critics tore it apart, and within a few months, it was gone. Still, for a show that failed so spectacularly, it left behind something rare. Footage that looks like retrofuturism exploded all over your screen. It's wild, lavish sets, bright lights, an entire casino inside a train. You cannot look away. It's hard not to respect just how bold it was, even if it collapsed under its own weight. Super Train was flashy, short-lived, and unforgettable for all the wrong, and maybe just a few right, reasons. This was the campfire that never needed matches. Are You Afraid of the Dark? Was more than just a kids' horror anthology. It was a rite of passage. A group of teens, calling themselves the Midnight Society, would gather in the woods to tell scary stories. But it was not the monsters that made it unforgettable. It was the mood, the hush that fell when someone tossed powder into the fire. The quiet intensity of those young faces as they leaned in. The way fear bonded them. Each episode was different. Ghosts, curses, supernatural oddities. Sometimes spooky, sometimes tragic, sometimes weirdly beautiful. But no matter the tale, there was always an emotional core. Loneliness, jealousy, guilt, love. The real ghosts hiding behind the fiction. The show gave kids permission to be afraid and taught them how to carry that fear with courage. Even in darkness, it said, we can find connection, empathy, and the power of shared stories. The show never pandered. It trusted its audience to handle fear and to learn from it. Kids tuned in not just to be scared, but to be part of something secret, something sacred. Watching it felt like sneaking into a world just for the brave. And then it was gone, slowly, quietly, replaced by brighter, safer content. But for those who remember, Are You Afraid of the Dark? Still flickers in the back of the mind like a campfire that refuses to go out. Because some stories do not end when the screen fades. They echo. If you were a kid in the early 80s, there was something irresistible about The Greatest American Hero. A regular guy gets handed a superhero suit by aliens. No instructions, no training manual, just a pair of bright red tights and a whole lot of confusion. His name was Ralph Hinckley, and from the very first episode, it was clear he was in over his head. He could fly, sort of. He could become invisible, sometimes. Mostly, he just crashed into stuff. And we loved him for it. Ralph was a high school teacher, the kind who wanted to do the right thing but kept getting dragged into wild situations. The show paired him up with an FBI agent named Bill Maxwell, a gruff, no-nonsense guy who wanted to save the world but had to do it with the most reluctant superhero of all time. And then there was Pam, Ralph's lawyer girlfriend, who somehow managed to hold the whole operation together with patience, wisdom, and the occasional eye roll. This was not like other superhero stories. There was no Batcave, no secret fortress, no perfect moral compass. Ralph's powers were unpredictable, and half the time he wanted to give the whole thing back. But the message underneath all the bumbling and broken windows was clear. You do not have to be perfect to do good. You just have to try. The show hit that perfect sweet spot between comedy and sincerity. It made fun of itself, sure. The theme song alone was a wink at how ridiculous everything was. But then it would surprise you, with a quiet moment, a moral choice. A little boy watching Ralph fly and suddenly believing in something bigger than himself. That was the magic of it. You might not remember every villain or plotline, but you remember how it made you feel. Like maybe someone ordinary, someone like you, could be a hero too. Not because they had powers, but because they had heart. And that is a kind of superpower we do not talk about enough anymore. So if the greatest American hero ever flew, or crashed, into your world, take a second and remember what it gave you. A laugh, a little hope, and a reason to believe that even the messiest of us can save the day. Do you remember Joanie and Chachi? Because someone at the network sure thought you did. In 1982, Joanie Loves Chachi hit the airwaves like a promise no one had really asked for. Spun off from the mega hit Happy Days, it took two fan-favorite characters and tried to stretch their romance into a full-blown sitcom. Sounds sweet, right? Maybe on paper. But the real story? It flopped, fast and hard. And what happened next might just make you rethink how much chemistry really matters on screen. Now, to be fair, Happy Days was basically the king of feel-good television back then. Families watched it religiously, and Joanie and Chachi were the kind of will-they-won't-they couple people genuinely rooted for. So when they finally got together, it made perfect sense to give them their own series. The idea was to follow them to Chicago, where Chachi was trying to make it big in music. And Joanie? She was just along for the ride. Already you can kind of see the problem. It was a spin-off that forgot what made the original work: balance. Happy Days thrived because it was never just about one couple, but about a community. Joanie Loves Chachi narrowed its focus so tightly that it squeezed out all the fun. Joanie Loves Chachi wanted to bottle that Happy Days magic but ended up chasing its own shadow. It was too familiar, yet somehow not familiar enough. The bar scenes were replaced with lounge gigs, the gang was swapped for backup musicians, and Richie and Fonzie, nowhere to be found. The cozy, nostalgic world of 1950s Americana was gone. What was left felt like a stage set nobody believed in. And let's talk about the music. Because yes, there was music. Every episode had a song, and Chachi was supposed to be some kind of rising crooner. Problem was, it sounded like someone took the leftover records from a high school talent show and called it a soundtrack. Not exactly Elvis. The ratings started strong, thanks to the Happy Days name, but dipped almost immediately. Viewers showed up expecting a sweet romantic comedy or a fun musical ride. What they got was a show trying too hard to be cool while forgetting what made it lovable. And maybe more importantly, it made Chachi less cool. He was never supposed to be leading man material. But now he had to carry scenes, hit punchlines, and sell love songs all at once. The chemistry between Joanie and Chachi? It kind of fizzled. The tension was gone, and without the playful back and forth of the old show, they just became a regular couple. A regular couple with regular problems, and a really boring band. Even die-hard fans started to check out. Joanie Loves Chachi only lasted 2 short seasons, and it faded from memory almost instantly after it ended. Unlike some cult flops that earn ironic love later, this one never really came back around. It became the kind of thing people reference in passing, usually as a cautionary tale. Not everything needs a sequel. Not every couple needs their own show. And sometimes, spinning off means spinning out. There are flops, and then there are disasters so extravagant that they seem to take a whole network down with them. Supertrain was NBC's attempt to build a blockbuster series around the concept of a futuristic, nuclear-powered luxury train. Think The Love Boat, but with wheels and none of the charm. It had all the ingredients of a hit, a massive budget, a unique setting, and plenty of hype. But something was off from the very beginning. The stories were thin, the characters forgettable, and the tone so inconsistent it gave viewers whiplash. Each episode felt like it was searching for its identity, wavering between drama, mystery, and comedy, but mastering none. The train itself, a giant, expensive model, was more impressive than anything the writers came up with. Behind the scenes, the budget spiraled out of control. It became the most expensive television series ever made at the time, but no amount of money could fix the fact that nobody cared about the people on board. The ratings crashed almost immediately. Critics savaged it. The audience, confused and underwhelmed, simply walked away. NBC tried to retool it. New characters, a shift in tone, but it was too late. Supertrain lasted only 9 episodes before it was quietly canceled. Today, it lives on as one of the most iconic failures in television history. A lavish machine with nowhere to go and no one left to watch it roll by. A beautiful wreck on the tracks of what might have been. NBC Sunday Showcase was not just a television program, it was a statement. It ran from 1959 to 1960 and was one of the first shows to dare to go big, bold, and in color at a time when most American homes were still adjusting to the idea that their television sets could be more than black and white. It was an anthology series, which meant it never stuck to one story, one cast, or even one genre. One week you would get a sweeping musical, and the next a gripping science fiction drama. It was television trying to be theater. Or maybe it was television becoming theater. The episode What Makes Sammy Run turned heads, but it was Murder and the Android that quietly earned a Hugo Award nomination and whispered something new into the ears of its audience, that science fiction could belong on television too. But the truth was, Sunday nights were a battleground, and even ambition was not enough to keep it alive. It faded quickly, not because it failed, but because it tried too much, too soon. Now it lives as a name in the margins of television history, waiting to be remembered by someone who once sat too close to the screen, eyes wide open, watching the future flicker into being. If you ever felt like you did not quite fit in, like you were one joke late or one outfit off, then Square Pegs probably hit you like a lightning bolt. It was awkward, It was sharp, and it was one of the most honest shows about high school that television dared to make in the early 80s. You had two best friends, Patty and Lauren, who were painfully aware they were not cool, and instead of turning them into underdog winners by episode 3, the show let them stay uncool, which made them feel incredibly real. Patty was played by Sarah Jessica Parker before she ever stepped foot in a pair of designer heels, and here she was all nerves and second guesses. She wanted so badly to be popular, but could not help but trip over her own honesty. Lauren was the dreamer, the schemer, always convinced she was just one clever plan away from finally fitting in. Together, they tried to navigate a high school that was basically a miniature version of the adult world, full of cliques, politics, confusion, and disappointment. Square Pegs did not glamorize anything. It did not try to be a public service announcement. It just let its characters exist. It let them fail. It let them make weird decisions. And that is what made it so quietly revolutionary. Because for the kids who were not the prom queens or football stars, for the ones sitting in the back of the cafeteria just hoping to get through lunch without embarrassment, this was the first time television really saw them. The dialogue was fast, dry, and way too clever for most sitcoms of the time. The fashion was gloriously 80s, all asymmetrical haircuts and oversized sweaters. And the soundtrack? Pure gold. New wave bands, synths, the kind of music that felt like it was just barely holding back its own awkward heartache. It only lasted one season, 18 episodes, but it left a mark. Because sometimes a short run is enough when every moment hits the truth so hard. It said what so many kids were thinking. That high school was hard, and not everyone got a makeover and a happy ending. Sometimes you just had to survive it, with a friend, with some sarcasm, and with the quiet hope that maybe someday your weirdness would be the best thing about you. So if you forgot Square Pegs, if it slipped through the cracks of your memory, let this be the moment you find it again. It was never trying to be cool, just honest. And sometimes that is the coolest thing of all. There was a time when the Starlost was supposed to be a game changer, a Canadian-American science fiction epic created by legendary author Harlan Ellison. It promised something rare for television in the early 1970s, a deep, thoughtful exploration of humanity's future. The premise was solid. Earth had been destroyed. The last of humanity lived aboard a gigantic space ark, divided into sealed biospheres, each preserving a different culture. But the execution? That was another story entirely. Everything that could go wrong did. The budget was slashed early in production. Sets were cheap, effects were amateurish, dialogue dragged on endlessly, and characters stumbled through episodes that felt like half-finished thoughts. Ellison was so disillusioned he removed his name from the credits. What was meant to be a rich, compelling universe became a series of dimly lit rooms filled with awkward pacing and empty revelations. Viewers who tuned in expecting the next Star Trek found themselves stranded in a slow-moving dream where nothing ever really happened. Ratings fell, critics turned cold, and by the end of its short run, just 16 episodes, the Starlost had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that big ideas are not enough without the tools to bring them to life. It remains a fascinating failure. It is the kind of show that leaves behind more questions than answers, and perhaps that is why some still seek it out today. Not to enjoy it, but to witness the fall of something that could have been great, a star that never quite made it into orbit. Misfits of Science was chaos, glorious, nerdy, electric chaos. It was like someone grabbed a comic book, poured soda on it, and let it come alive on Friday night television. You had a team of outcasts with powers they barely understood, trying to do good while the world looked at them like a science fair gone wrong. And in the middle of it all was Dr. Billy Hayes, a scientist with no powers, just a lot of enthusiasm and absolutely no idea what he had signed up for. There was Johnny B., a rock guitarist who got electrocuted and came back with lightning-speed reflexes and the ability to shoot bolts of electricity from his hands. Elvin, a guy who could shrink to the size of a Barbie doll. And Gloria, a telekinetic teen who could move objects with her mind, usually after rolling her eyes at the chaos around her. Together, They were the Misfits of Science. And they were, well, a bit of a mess. But that was the charm. The 80s had a lot of shows about heroes, but this one was about the ones who did not get it right the first time. Or the second. Or the third. They were weird. They were unpredictable. But they meant well. And that meant everything. It did not last long, only one season. But the people who watched it never forgot it, because there was something honest in how messy it was, how much it tried to mix humor, action, and heart in a world that was not ready for it yet. It was a superhero show for kids who felt like they were always out of sync, a little too fast, too loud, too strange to fit in. The music, the neon, the chaotic energy, it all screamed 80s in the best possible way. And under the surface, there was a real question. What happens when you do not fit the mold? When your powers do not make sense? When the world says you are too much, too odd, too different? Misfits of Science said, be different anyway. Be weird, be loud, be kind. And maybe, just maybe, save the day in the process. Which of these sitcoms do you still think about long after the credits rolled? Let us know in the comments, tap like if even one brought back a smile, and subscribe so we can keep shining a light on the shows that deserved more than they got.